readers, it's Lori. Welcome back to my channel. I'm so happy you're here today, and I do have a caveat for you. Today's content will be about novels that are a little bit hard for some people to take. So if you have a very gentle constitution, this video today may not be for you. So I wanted to come and tell you a little bit about why I have a particular love for novels and nonfiction work about serial killers. It has a root into my childhood that is maybe interesting to you and kind of funny to some degree for me. It's a funny memory in my family for sure. So in 1966, a man named Richard Speck was killing nurses in the Chicagoland area where I grew up. In fact, there were lots of news accounts about this particular man and about what he was doing. And I'm certain that this is probably how I found out about Richard Speck, because I don't remember any particular conversations but with my parents about this. My mother would not have watched the news in detail about this sort of thing because she had a very frail constitution when it came to that kind of level of violence. And I don't think that the news in the 1960s was as graphic and as detailed as it is now. But in some way, I heard that Richard Speck was going around communities that I lived near and killing nurses. And so I felt compelled as a 5-year-old child to go door to door in my neighborhood and warn people that he was on the loose and that he was killing people. What happened next was my neighbors called my mom and said that I was running around door to door warning them about Richard Speck. And so she put a stop to that fairly quickly. But I do think that that is kind of the root of my curiosity about people who engage in these kinds of multiple murders, especially when they are kind of following the true serial killer distinction, which is that they have targeted a specific group of people that has something in common, and they are obsessed with eliminating that group of people. So in Richard Speck's case, it was nurses. In other cases, there have been serial killers who have engaged in murdering gay men. There are a multitude of them, and I could really talk about this for hours, but we're going to limit it today to a couple of series or books that are my favorites, and then a couple that I would like to get to in the next year. Nothing urgent, certainly, but books that have been kind of in my sights, and I've been curious about them. So let's start with the ones that I've read. So on the fiction side, one of the books that stands out, or the series that stands out the most to me, is the Hannibal Lecter series by Thomas Harris. Red Dragon is the first in this series, then followed by The Silence of the Lambs, Hannibal, and Hannibal Rising. I think I own all of these. Of course, some of my books, as you know, are still in boxes, and so I'm not certain, but I'm pretty sure I do have all of them. I did read them in order. I discovered Red Dragon while we were living in Washington, D.C. I clearly remember I had young children at that time. Megan was only a few years old. But I remember clearly that I finished that book. I read it from start to finish in one sitting, essentially. I remember pretty much ditching everything else I had to do. Luckily, someone else was helping me care for my kids, right? And just reading that from start to finish. But I also finished it in a super fast pace. This one, the first one, follows Jack Crawford and kind of the origin of this Jack Crawford FBI story that follows through all 4 of these novels. Jack Crawford actually does go to Hannibal Lecter for some help in solving a serial killer crime committed by someone that the FBI has named the Tooth Fairy. I won't go into a lot of detail because I do think it's good to go into these kind of blind, but this theme carries through the rest of the novels too, as Silence of the Lambs you probably have heard of. Pretty classic movie adaptation that a lot of people have seen. That one also follows an FBI agent who is looking to Hannibal Lecter for some assistance in discovering more about a serial killer that they cannot seem to catch. I do think these are probably my top favorite novels about serial killers, but I'm also open to new ones. So if you have any that you particularly loved, throw them my way. Another one I read about a year ago, I think, is 13 by Steve Kavanaugh. This was the Eddie Flynn series. And I had seen a YouTuber start talking about this book a little over a year ago. And I was fascinated by the depiction of the plot. When I looked on Goodreads to find it, I discovered that I had put it on my list to read years before that and just had never gotten to it. So it was interesting to me that one I dropped for whatever reason, but I did. 13, while it is the fourth in the Eddie Flynn series, does not need to be read after you've read the first three. So I felt very comfortable with stepping into this and maybe not stepping back in. Like I just felt like this one was the one I was meant to read. And here's why. The premise of 13, or the plot development of 13, is that there is a murder that occurs of a young woman who is married to an actor. She's killed brutally in her room, in her bed. And the actor is the suspect for this murder, that they think he killed his wife. Eddie is hired to help on the defense team to support the trial of this particular actor. And the actor found her and discovered her, and of course was traumatized by all this. There was some pretty damning evidence that linked him to this crime. As he's going to trial, they choose the jury for this particular case, and you know this in the premise of the book, the actual killer of this particular woman is putting himself forward to be considered for jury duty service. He's done this very diabolically, and he is selected to be on the jury. So, of course, it is his mission to ensure that this jury convicts this man. And, of course, it's Eddie Flynn's mission to make sure that this man is not convicted. I flew through this one too. I recommended it immediately to my kids, my kids who have that ability and that sensibility to be able to be with this kind of a story. I recommend it to a lot of people. It is great suspense. It takes lots of twists and turns. I didn't give it 5 stars. I gave it 4 stars, and I'm really not certain now, all this time later, why that's so, because I didn't take as detailed of notes then about my reading as I do now, but I did enjoy it very, very much. A more recent read that I enjoyed a good bit is A Flicker in the Dark by Stacey Willingham. This was a book of the month selection for me in January of 2022. This one is about Chloe Davis, and she, as a child, was living in Louisiana. I love that, that setting. And a number of people in this small town where she lived were killed at the hands of a serial killer. And her father was arrested and convicted for those crimes and has spent all of these years since in prison. Chloe becomes a psychologist, and she's trying to live her life outside of this bubble of scandal that happened to her when she was a young person. But then nearby, some murders start to occur, and they look and feel very similar to the murders that happened when her father was convicted. And she is afraid and disturbed, and also really questioning whether her father actually committed those crimes. I did not give this one 5 stars, but I did give it 4, and I do remember really enjoying it. I do think that it has had a great pace, and it had a little bit for me of predictability. So I felt like I was pretty sure that I knew who did it right before it was revealed. So not through the whole book. There were a couple other times where I thought, oh, well, maybe it's that person. But so it wasn't totally unsolvable by the reader for sure, but I did enjoy it very much. I did not choose her newest one from Book of the Month. It was not about serial killers. It was about a child who's abducted, and those are always a little tricky for me. It's interesting. I have the stomach for serial killers, but I don't necessarily have the stomach for people who take children. So there you go. We're all just aware of our own limitations. Back to my childhood, when I was staying with my aunt and uncle, and I had to have been probably a preteen because we hadn't yet moved to Florida. And I moved to Florida when I was 13, I think. I was staying with my aunt and uncle in Florida one summer, and they had a pool and they had a library. So I was that child who was in the pool all day. And when I wasn't in the pool, I was reading. And my uncle had a copy of Helter Skelter by Vincent Bugliosi. Now, I did have an awareness of who Charles Manson was. He made the news a lot when he was in his heyday, if you will. And I had always been curious about that. And I discovered that this book had been written by one of the investigators on this team. Of course, this is nonfiction. And I remember going through this very quickly too, not in one day, because it's a chunker, but I do vividly remember spending a lot of my time reading this. And because I wasn't quite sure that my aunt and uncle were keen on me reading this, I only read it when they were not necessarily around. So they both worked, and I could read it in bed. But I did really find all the moments that I could to read this book. And my cousin was staying part of the time there too. He was older, way older than me. He was an adult. And I remember him knowing that I was reading Helter Skelter and not saying anything about it. So, I have some pretty good cousins in my life. They had my back. The Charles Manson murders were also very incredible in the sense that he was this cultish leader of people who were really attracted to him because he had this sort of prophetic message that there were things that were going to happen and that they needed to be aware of those things. And there was this sort of twisted way of getting them to buy into the fact that they needed to help him to kill certain people. I don't want to go into a lot of detail because I do think that it is, if you've not heard of this story, it would be great if you could go into it without knowing a whole lot. And if you have heard of this story, I still think that there will be things that will surprise you. It was a very tragic, very, very tragic crimes. One of the women that was murdered by this team of people that were connected to Charles Manson was pregnant and very famous at that time. I can't tell you that this is an easy read. I think it is easier to read a novel that you can sort of suspend your belief around and know that this is not actually true. This one may be one of the most disturbing stories. These were some pretty messed up people. And also, it really gives you a perspective on how one kind of charismatic, devious person who has some scattered thinking and definitely some sick and evil tendencies can really persuade people to do what he wants them to do. Suffice it to say, this one is intense, and it is told by the man who was a part of the investigation and the prosecution of Charles Manson. So it is in his words, it is in his experience, it is what he knows about what happened. There are photographs in this novel, or in this book, and there is a lot of detail. So it is too much for some people, but for me, it was a very compelling read. And then the last one I'm going to talk about that I've read is The Devil in the White City by Eric Larson. And this covers a lot of things during the World's Fair in the city of Chicago. in the 1800s. It covers way more than I want it to about the architecture and the building of the structures for the World's Fair. I really wanted this to be more about the serial killer H.H. Holmes. It was not. So let's just talk about that honestly for a moment. H.H. Holmes' real name was Herman Webster Mudgett. And I always have to look at that because it's just not how I kind of know him in my head. But he was also Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. He was a doctor. He's not necessarily considered a serial killer in the true sense of the word for some scholars and writers, because his crimes were mostly in response to someone finding out what he was doing, who then needed to be silenced. However, in the sense that he killed a number of people in a kind of the same trajectory, he could be labeled as a serial killer. But this one is indeed very different. He also claimed to have killed 27 people, but when the investigators followed up on these claims, at that time, it wasn't readily available to them, state to state, what was happening to other victims, right? And he did travel a bit, and it also was just not always available to family members that something had happened to their family members, especially if they weren't close. So 27 murders is what he ended up confessing to, but some of those people were verified as living. So he kind of had an ego that, well, not kind of, he had an ego that was huge. And he was happy in the end to confess. He was almost proud of what he had done. He did, though, at first claim innocence to all this, and then later indicated that he had done this, but he had been possessed by Satan. He was very cunning. He had a great knack for creating relationships with people, and he moved around a good bit, which concealed a lot of his crimes. As I recall, there was something called a murder castle. There was a building where he did most of the killing of his victims. And then, of course, he was trying to keep people out of that space. So I feel like there was also a storage space, or maybe that was a storage space. It's been a while since I read this one, but Erik Larson's nonfiction is also very dense, but it's even more dense than some of the others, because his attention to detail, especially to detail that is probably somewhat insignificant to your average reader, is very high. But, and again, like I said, there were a lot of other things, but if you could just read the parts about H.H. Holmes, I think you would find it to be somewhat incredible and enjoyable if you like this sort of thing. Okay, let's talk about what I'd like to read. There's one that it has some mixed reviews, and I'm drawn to it for a couple of reasons. One, because it was written by one of the co-hosts of the Morbid podcast, and two, because it's set in Louisiana as well, which is near where I live, in the bayous of southern Louisiana. This one is The Butcher and the Wren by Elena Urquhart, and I also love it because it has a Patricia Cornwell kind of feel to it. So there is a serial killer who is murdering women with some medical experimentation techniques, which is interesting. A forensic pathologist, Dr. Ren Mueller, is tasked with trying to connect the evidence to a particular pattern of person, to someone that they could identify as a potential subject. Medical examiners, pathologists often get involved in these kinds of things because there are similarities, again, with serial killers. There are very similar ways in which they commit those crimes. And so this one sounds very procedural and methodical, and it does sound like it has some Patricia Cornwell vibes. That's a whole nother, I love Patricia Cornwell, so that's a whole other video. But I do love the Morbid podcast. I do like this premise. And again, I've seen some people really love it, or they really don't. So we'll see. But I do think it might be worth picking up. Another one that's interesting to me is Wonderland by Jennifer Hillier. I've read a few by Jennifer Hillier, and I have enjoyed them. This one has the creepiest cover of all, and it does involve a murder that happens at a circus or at a carnival. So they discover a body. Vanessa Castro is new on the job, and she is assigned to this case to try to discover what happened to this dead person that they have discovered, the carnival workers have discovered on the property. And as they begin this investigation, they discover that this murder is not unlike some other past murders that were unsolved. So that's where the serial killer piece is coming up for me. I feel like this is probably the same killer over and over time. I would be curious to see if it is a serial killer rather than just kind of a more random killer. I have enjoyed Jennifer Hillier's novels that I've read so far, and I think I would like to give this one a try just because of the creepy clown cover stuff that's happening around it as well. It sounds like a great setting for a suspense thriller. The Whisper Man by Alex North has been on my TBR for a while, but I actually read another novel by Alex North and didn't really like it. So I haven't picked up The Whisper Man yet. However, it does have better ratings than the one I read, and it does have a serial killer in the plot. I may give this a shot this year. So this follows Tom Kennedy, and he and his son move to a new town. They really want a fresh start, and they move into this home, and everything has the sense of promise about it until a young boy who's about his son's age disappears. There was a man named Frank Carter who had been accused of a number of serial murders over time. And this really reminds people of Frank Carter's style of murdering and covering up his crimes. So there is a fear that something is happening again. Of course, I'm sure Tom and his son are somehow in the thick of this. It has an average rating on Goodreads of 4.04, which is certainly good. Alex North isn't a bad writer. I think what I didn't like about the other one that I read was that it had some kind of implausible character development. There were just some things I remember that I had to kind of suspend belief around, and I don't know, it meandered. That's what I remember, honestly, it meandered. And the last one, I'm going to have to read the title to you because it's long. This is a nonfiction read I'd like to get to, and it is called You Think You Know Me by Ryan Green. The subtitle is The True Story of Herb Baumeister and the Horror at Fox Hollow Farm. In 1994, Eric Baumeister was playing in the yard. He was about 11 or 13, I think, and he discovered some skeletal remains, or a bone, if you will, and he brings it to his mother. So they discover that there's a skeleton in their yard, and she's very disturbed. The mom is very disturbed by this. And so she goes to her husband and says, how is this possible? I think it's a family farm. And he says, well, his dad was an anesthesiologist, and he did some experimentation with this body for his research. And she believed him. Then later, of course, more bodies are discovered and more information and evidence leads to Herb. I have high hopes for this one. It's been out since 2018. And what I really like about it is this is a lesser known serial killer to me. I know a lot less about Herb Baumeister than I know about, some of the other, like Ted Bundy and some of the other more famous serial killers, if you will. And it's not like I don't want to read about, and I have read some books about Ted Bundy in the past and watched some adaptations, but I like to kind of get to know people that I don't have any prior knowledge of, because it's a little bit less predictable for me when I read it. So I do think that this one is one that I might try to find. I'm also open, if you have other suggestions about nonfiction or fiction about serial killers, if this is a genre that you're particularly interested in, I'm really wide open as to what you've read and what you've enjoyed or what you would recommend. It's hard to talk about enjoying books about serial killers, isn't it? But honestly, it is a it is a pattern of human development that both lends itself to the retelling of people's stories so that we understand as a society how these kinds of things happen and what they're connected to, which almost always is a significant mental health disorder and a major amount of trauma in someone's life or some sort of deviant behavior that was modeled for them. And then in terms of the fiction, it's like endless for people to be able to kind of create these fictional scenarios that are rooted possibly in other real life experiences or that are just a result of their creative imagination. When they're done well, I cannot get enough of them. I will let you know if and when I read any of the new ones that I presented today, and I would be curious to know how you feel if you've read or if you're interested in reading some of the others. I would love to know that too. But thanks for joining me around my foray into explaining why serial killers have always been kind of a memorable thing for me and why I do look to read them as an adult. It could have had the exact opposite effect on me, certainly, but I think that I was shaped by a family that was, for the most part, with the exception of my mom, more open to these kinds of reads than not. I will have some more content that's similar to this coming up, so stay tuned for that. And as always, happy reading. Thanks. Bye.